Chapter 13, Part 2 of 2.
But when he turned to the woman who lay unconscious on the ground, a sob burst from his lips, and tears were streaming down his dust-grimmed cheeks. As he knelt beside her, he called her again that name which, a year before, he had whispered as he stood with an empty, outstretched arms alone on the summit of the divide. Lifting her in his arms, he carried her to the hammock, and finding water and towel, wet her brow and face, and all the while, in agony of fear, he talked to her with words of love. Overwrought by the unexpected and, to him, almost the miraculous meeting with Helen, weak and shaken by the strain of those moments of her danger, when her life depended so wholly upon his coolness and skill, unnerved by the sight of her lying so still and white, and beside himself with the strength of his passion, the man made no effort to account for her presence in that wild and lonely spot, so far from the scenes amid which he had learned to know and love her. He was conscious only that she was there, that she had been very near to death, that he had held her in his arms, and that he loved her with all the strength of his manhood. Presently, with a low cry of joy, he saw the blood creep back into her white cheeks. Slowly her eyes opened, and she looked wonderingly up into his face. "Helen," he breathed. "Helen."
"Why, Larry,"
she murmured, still confused and wondering.
"So it was you, after all. But what in the world are you doing here like this? They told me your name was Patches."
Then the man spoke. Almost fiercely his words come without thought. "I'm here because I'd do anything. I'd be anything that a man could be and do to win your love. A year ago, when I told you of my love and asked you to be my wife, and like the silly, pampered, petted fool that I was, thought that my wealth and the life that I offered could count for anything for a woman like you, you laughed at me. You told me that if ever you married, you'd wed a man, not a fortune or social position. You made me see myself as I was, a useless idler, a dummy for tailors, a superficial chatterer of nothing but vain and shallow women. You told me that I possessed not one manly trait of character that could compel the genuine love of an honest woman. You let me see the truth, and that my proposal to you was almost an insult. You made me understand that your very friendship for me was such a friendship as you would have with an amusing, irresponsible boy or spoiled child. You could not even consider my love for you seriously, as a woman like you would consider the love for a strong man, and you were right, Helen. But good grief, it was a bitter, bitter lesson. I went from you, ashamed to look men in the face. I felt myself guilty, a pitiful, weak, and cowardly thing with no right to even exist. In my humiliation, I ran from all who knew me, and I came out here to escape from the life that made me what I was, that robbed me of my manhood. And here, by chance, in the contests at the celebration in Prescott, I saw a man, a cowboy, who possessed everything that I lacked, and for the lack of which you had laughed at me. And then, alone one night, I faced myself, and I fought it out. I knew you were right, Helen, but it was not easy to give up the habits and luxury to which my life I had been accustomed. It was not easy, I say, but my love for you made it a glorious thing to do. And I hoped and believed that if I proved myself a man, I could go back to you in the strength of my manhood, and you would listen to me. And so, penniless and a stranger, under an assumed name, I sought useful, necessary work that called for the highest quality of manhood. And I won, Helen. I know that I've won. Today, Patches the cowboy can look any man in the face, He can take his place and hold his own among men of any class anywhere. I have regained that of which circumstance of birth and inheritance and training robbed me. I have won the right of a man to come to you again, and I claim you now, Helen. I tell you again that I love you. I love you as—"
Larry, Larry,
she cried, springing to her feet, drawing away from him, as though not suddenly awake from a strange spell.
Larry, you mustn't. What do you mean? How can you say such things to me?
He answered her with reckless passion. I say such things because I'm a man and because you are the woman I love and want. Because— She cried out again in protest.
Oh, stop, stop. Please stop. Don't you know?
Know what? He demanded.
My husband, she gasped. Stanford Manning, we're here on our honeymoon.
She saw him flinch as though from a heavy blow, and put out his hand on the trunk of a tree near where they stood to steady himself. He did not speak, but his lips moved as though he repeated her words to himself over and over again, and he gazed at her with a strange, bewildered, doubting look, as though he could not believe his own suffering. Impulsively, Helen took a step towards him.
Larry.
Her voice seemed to arouse him, and he stood erect as though by conscious will of effort. Then that old self-mocking smile was upon his lips. He was laughing at his hurt, making sport of himself in his cruel predicament. But to Helen, there was that in his smile which wrung her woman heart.
Oh, Larry, she said gently, forgive me, I'm sorry,
He put out his hand with a gesture of protest, and his voice was calm and courteous. I beg your pardon, Helen. It was stupid of me to not have understood. I forgot myself for a moment. It was all so unexpected meeting you like this. I didn't think. He turned away towards his waiting horse and to the steer laying on the ground. So, you and Stanford Manning. Good old Stan. I'm glad for him. And for you too, Helen. Why, it was I who introduced him to you, do you remember? He smiled again, that mirthless, self-mocking smile, as he added, without giving her time to speak, If you'll excuse me for a moment, I'll rid your camp of this unwelcome presence of that beast over yonder. Then he went towards his horse, as though turning for relief to the work that had become so familiar to him. She watched him, while he released the steer and drove the animal away over the ridge, where he permitted it to escape into the wild haunts where it lived its outlaw companions. When he rode back to the little camp, Stanford had returned. For an hour they talked together as old friends, but Helen, well, she offered now and then a word or remark or asked a question, or laughed and smiled with them, left the talk mostly to the two men. Stanford, when the first shock of learning of Helen's narrow escape was over, was gaily enthusiastic and warm of his admiration of his old friend, who, for no apparent reason but the wish to assert his own manhood, turned his back upon the ease and luxury of his wealth to live a life of adventurous hardship. And Patches, as he insisted they should call him, with many a jesting laugh and droll comment, told them of his new life and work. He was only serious when he made them promise to keep his identity a secret until he himself was ready to reveal his real name. "And what do you propose to do when your game of Patches is played out?" Stanford asked curiously. For an instant they saw him smiling mockingly at himself, and answered lightly, "Well, probably try some other fool experiment, I reckon." Stanford chuckled. The reply was so like the cowboy Patches, and so unlike his old friend Larry Knight. "As for that, Stan," Patches continued, "I don't see that the game will ever be played out, as you say. Certainly I can never now go back altogether to what I was. The fellow you used to know in Cleveland is not really I, you see. Fact is, I think that fellow's quite dead. Peace to be his ashes. The world is wide, and there's always work for a man to do. The appearance of Phil Acton on the ridge, at the spot where the steer, followed by Patches, had first appeared, put an end to the further conversation with Lawrence Knight. "My boss," said that gentleman, in his character of the Patches the cowboy, as the cross-triangle foreman halted his horse on the brow of the hill and sat looking down upon the camp. "Be careful, please, and don't let 'em suspect that you ever saw me before. I'll sure catch it now for loafing so long." "I know him," said Stanford. Then he called to the man above. "Come on down, Acton. Be sociable." Phil rode into camp and shook hands with Stanford cordially, and was presented to Miss Manning, to whom he spoke with a touch of embarrassment. And then he said, with a significant look at Patches, "I'm glad to meet you people, Mr. Mannings, but we really haven't much time to be social right now. Mr. Baldwin sent me with an outfit into this Granite Basin country to gather some of those outlaw steers. He expects us to be on the job." Turning to Patches, he continued, "When you didn't come back, I thought you must have met with some serious trouble and trailed you. We've managed to lose a good deal of time altogether. That steer you were after, did you get away, did he?"
Helen spoke quickly. "Oh, Mr. Acton, you mustn't blame Mr. Patches for what happened. Really, you mustn't. No one was to blame, it just happened."
She stopped, unable to finish the explanation, for she was thinking of the part of the incident which was known only to herself and Patches. Stanford told in a few words of his wife's danger and how the cowboy had saved her. "That's some mighty good work, Patches," Phil said heartily. "Mighty good work. I'm sorry, Mr. Mannings, that our coming up here after those outlaws happened just at this time. It's too bad that we disturbed you and Miss Manning. We're going home Friday. However, I'll tell the boys to keep clear of your neighborhood in the meantime." As the two cross-triangle men walked their horses, Helen and Stanford heard Phil ask, "But where's that steer, Patches?" "I'll let him go." "You let him go?" exclaimed the foreman. "After you had him roped and tied? What'd you do that for?" Patches was confused. "Really, I don't know." "I'd like to know what you figure we're up here for," said Phil sharply. "You not only wasted 2 or 3 hours visiting with those people, but you take my time trailing you up, and then you lose a steer after you get 'em. It looks like you've lost your head mighty bad after all." "I'm afraid you're right, Phil," Patches answered quietly. Helen looked at her husband, but Stanford was grinning with delight. "To think," he murmured, "of Larry Knight taking a dressing down like that from a mere cowboy foreman." But Patches was by no means so meek in spirit as he appeared on his outward manner. He had been driven almost to the verge of desperation by the trying situation, and was fighting for self-control. To take his foreman's rebuke in the presence of his friends was not easy. "I reckon I'd better send you to the home ranch tonight instead of Bob," continued Phil, as the two men mounted their horses and sat for a moment facing each other. "It looks like we could spare you best. Tell Uncle Will to send the chuck wagon and 3 more punchers, and that we'll start for the home ranch Friday. And be sure you get back here tomorrow." "Shall I go now?" "Yes, you can go now." Patches wheeled his horse and rode away while Phil disappeared over the ridge in the direction from which he had come. When the two cowboys were out of sight, Helen went straight to her husband, and to Stanford's consternation when he took her into his arms, she was crying. What is it?" he said, holding her close. But she only answered between sobs as she clung to him, It's nothing. Never mind, Stan. I'm just upset." And Stanford quite naturally thought it was only a case of nerves caused by the danger through which she had just passed. For nearly an hour Patches rode towards the home ranch, taking only such notice of his surroundings as was necessary in order for him to keep direction. Through the brush and timber, over the ridges, down into the valleys and washes, and along the rock-strewn mountain slides, he allowed his horse to pick his way and take his own gait with scarcely a touch of rein or spur. The twilight hour was beginning when he reached a point from which he could see in the distance the red roofs of the cross-triangle buildings. Checking his horse, he sat for a long time motionless, looking away over the broad land that had come to mean so much to him, as though watching the passing of the day. But the man did not note the changing colors in the western skies. He did not see the shadows deepening. He was not thinking of the coming of night. The sight of the distant spot that, a year before, had held such possibilities for him when, on the summit of the divide, he had chosen between two wildly separated ways of life, brought to him now a keener realization of the fact that he was again placed where he must choose. The sun was down upon those hopes and dreams that in the first hard weeks of his testing had inspired and strengthened him. The night of despairing, reckless abandonment of the very ideals of manhood for which he had so bravely struggled was upon him, while the spirit and strength of that manhood which he had so hardly attained fought against its surrender. When Stanford had asked, "What will you do when your game of patches is played out?" he had said that the man whom they had known in the old days was dead. Would this new man also die? Deliberately the man turned about and started back the way he had come. In their honeymoon camp that evening, when the only light in the sky was the light of the stars, and the campfire's ruddy flames made weird shadows come and go in the little glade, Helen, laying in the hammock, and Stanford, sitting near her, talking of their old friend Lawrence Knight. But as they talked, they did not know that a lonely horseman had stopped on the other side of the low ridge, and leaving his horse had crept quietly through the brush to a point on the low brow of the hill where he could look down into the camp. From where he lay in the darkness, the man could see against the camp's firelight the two, where the hammock swung under the trees. He could hear the low murmur of their voices with now and then a laugh. But it was always the man who laughed, for there was little mirth in Helen's heart that night. Then he saw Stanford go into the tent and return again to the hammock, and soon there came floating up to him the sweet, plaintive music of Helen's guitar, and then her voice, full and low, with a wealth of womanhood in the tone, as she sang a love song to her mate. Later, when the dancing flames of the campfire had fallen to a dull red glow, he saw them go arm in arm into their tent, and then all was still. The red glow of the fire dimmed to a spark, and darkness drew close about the scene. But even in the darkness, the man could still see under the wide, sheltering arms of the trees a lighter spot, the white tent. "Gethsemane," said the dean to me once, when our talk had ranged wide and touched upon many things. "Gethsemane ain't no place, it's something that happens. Whenever a man goes up against himself, right there is where Gethsemane is. And right there, too, it's sure to be a fight. A man might not always know about it at the time. He might be too busy fighting to understand just what it means, but he'll know about it afterward. No matter which side of him wins, he'll know afterwards that it was one big fight for his life."
End of chapter 13.